The letter arrived on a night when the wind howled like a dying thing, rattling the windows of Evelyn Harrow's quiet cottage. No return address, no markings, just her name written in a hand she had not seen in years. Inside, a single line scrawled in hurried ink. "You were right. He is alive." The teacup in her hand slipped, shattering against the wooden floor, but Evelyn did not hear it. Because if the letter was true, then everything she had buried, every whispered warning, every missing clue, had just clawed its way back from the dead. The village of St. Mary Mead woke with the slow, deliberate grace of an old cat, stretching in the morning sun. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, winding around thatched roofs like a ghost reluctant to leave. Sparrows bickered over crumbs on the cobbled streets, and the church bell chimed with the steady certainty of a place where, at least on the surface, nothing ever truly changed. But as with all quiet places, the stillness was merely a veil. Beneath it, something stirred. At number 6 High Street, Miss Agatha Marple sat by her lace-curtained window, her teacup resting on its saucer with military precision. A neat pile of wool and knitting needles lay beside her, momentarily forgotten. Her focus, sharp as ever, rested on the crisp pages of the Morning Herald. She skimmed through the grand affairs of the world, parliamentary debates, a film star's latest scandal, until her gaze settled on something far smaller, tucked away on the third page. Prominent socialite found dead in Mayfair home, police investigating. She read it twice, her lips pressing together, not in shock, nor in disapproval, but in something far more dangerous, interest. A murder in Mayfair, how convenient. Before she could dwell on it further, a commotion outside drew her attention. With the air of a woman resigned to village theatrics, she rose, adjusting her woolen shawl as she stepped onto her neatly swept doorstep. Down the lane, Mrs. Weatherby stood near the greengrocer's cart, gesturing wildly as she spoke, her voice tinged with unease. "I tell you, Mrs. Harris, it was the strangest thing, a man standing by the post box at 6:30, just standing there, mind you, like he was waiting for something. And when I passed, he tipped his hat and walked off, just walked off into the mist, like an apparition." Mrs. Harris, whose curiosity rivaled only her flair for the dramatic, gasped. "An apparition? Oh now, Mrs. Weatherby, we don't have those in St. Mary Mead. Ghosts belong in crumbling old mansions, not outside the post office." "Well, apparition or not, I've never seen him before, and I know everyone in this village," Mrs. Weatherby declared, her nod emphatic, as if that settled the matter. Miss Marple, who had been listening with the outward air of someone contemplating the price of apples, finally spoke. "How curious. Did you happen to notice what sort of hat he was wearing, Mrs. Weatherby?" The older woman turned flustered at being questioned with such precise observation. "Well, I suppose it was a dark hat. Something respectable, a bowler, I think. Certainly not a cap." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her teacup. A bowler hat. How interesting. The greengrocer, a stout man accustomed to more gossip than vegetables before breakfast, gave a short chuckle, most likely a visitor. "Come to see that cousin of the vicar, perhaps." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though she did not think so. Small things in life, after all, were rarely as small as they appeared. And a stranger in St. Mary Mead, one who, as Mrs. Weatherby so dramatically put it, was waiting for something, was an oddity worth noting. She let the conversation drift into trivialities before making her way back inside. The newspaper still lay open where she had left it, the words crisp and unassuming, "Prominent socialite found dead in Mayfair." Miss Marple sat once more, took a sip of her now lukewarm tea, and considered the curious timing of things. A murder in London. A stranger in St. Mary Mead. Coincidence? Perhaps. And yet, as she well knew, coincidence had a most remarkable way of proving itself rather inconvenient for murderers. The morning peace was broken by the unmistakable clip-clop of approaching hooves on the lane. Miss Marple, who had been arranging her knitting needles with the precision of a military campaign, looked up just as a shadow fell across her lace curtains. The postman, young Mr. Graves, came into view. His cap was tilted at an angle that suggested he had once attempted a jaunty look, but had quickly abandoned the effort. He moved at his usual brisk pace, but there was something, some small hesitation, barely noticeable, just outside her gate. A momentary pause, a falter, before he placed the letter in the box. Miss Marple did not rush to retrieve it. Instead she took another sip of her tea, now at the precise temperature she liked best. Disruptions, she firmly believed, should be given their due gravity. Only after finishing her sip did she rise and collect the envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, expensive, the kind of paper that spoke not just of importance, but of the sender's belief in their own importance. And Miss Marple had long since learned to pay attention to such details. The envelope lay untouched on the small oak table, its edges crisp, its weight heavier than mere paper should allow. The seal, dark blue and finely embossed, bore the insignia of the Metropolitan Constabulary of London. Miss Agatha Marple, seated comfortably in her high-backed chair by the fire, regarded it with the quiet scrutiny of a woman who understood the weight of official correspondence. A letter from Scotland Yard was seldom a bearer of pleasant tidings, and this one, she suspected, was no exception. She turned it over in her hands, noting the fine press of the seal, the faint scent of ink and bureaucracy that clung to it, an aroma of formalities and quiet urgency. But she did not open it. That was not her way. Instead, she placed it beside her tea, letting it sit, untouched, as she finished her thoughts. Mary Mead murmured on in its usual rhythm. Mrs. Weatherby's voice carried from the greengrocer's, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer punctuated the air, and somewhere a dog barked with unnecessary persistence. It was a familiar symphony, one she had listened to for years, yet this morning it felt strangely small, as though the world beyond had already begun to encroach upon it. Only when her tea had cooled to the precise temperature she preferred did she reach for the envelope, breaking the seal with a measured, deliberate hand. The letter inside was written in a firm, precise script, unembellished and straight to the point. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, "I trust this letter finds you in good health. A matter has arisen which requires a mind of particular acuity. A gentleman of standing, Sir Hugo Blake, was found deceased in his Mayfair residence under circumstances that, while not immediately suspicious, have raised certain concerns. The household is an insular one, and our inquiries are proving delicate. Your reputation precedes you, and your past consultations have been of invaluable service in matters that elude conventional detection. It would be an honor to have your insights once more. Should you be amenable, travel arrangements will be made at your convenience. I have no doubt you will find the matter, if nothing else, of interest. Sincerely, Inspector Reginald Fletcher, Scotland Yard." Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it with the care of a woman who wasted nothing, not even unnecessary gestures. Sir Hugo Blake, a name familiar enough, though never one she had reason to concern herself with. He was one of those men whose presence in the newspapers was not for scandal, but for the simple fact of their existence, wealthy, connected, a figure of quiet influence rather than notoriety. And now, he was dead. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence with its steady warmth, but her mind was elsewhere. She glanced out the window, watching as the last tendrils of morning fog lifted, revealing the village in all its familiar charm. She knew these streets as well as she knew her own mind, could predict their daily dramas with effortless certainty. St. Mary Mead was predictable. It did not ask anything of her beyond the occasional sharp-eyed comment, the well-timed knowing smile. London, however, London was something else entirely. A world of whispered intrigues, of corridors where footsteps echoed a little too sharply, of rooms where secrets curled in the air like the smoke of expensive cigars. A world where she was neither expected nor known. Miss Marple pressed her hands together, the faintest trace of a smile at the corners of her lips. She did not need to go, and yet she had always believed that the most dangerous thing in life was a mind left unoccupied for too long. Carefully, she placed the letter atop the mantelpiece, a decision unspoken yet already made. A lady, after all, should never rush into things, even when she knew, deep down, exactly what she was going to do. The train pulled into Victoria Station with a slow, shuddering sigh, exhaling steam that mingled with the thick London fog. Through the swirling mist, figures emerged and disappeared like phantoms, porters in dark uniforms, ladies with feathered hats, businessmen in tailored coats, striding forward with the purpose of men who had never known uncertainty. A whistle shrieked in the distance, followed by the sharp clatter of carriage doors being flung open. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible wool coat, and carrying a modest but well-worn handbag, stepped onto the platform with the precise, careful movements of someone unaccustomed to the city's hurried chaos. The scent of coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint metallic tang of rain filled the air, a city's perfume, layered with 1,000 stories waiting to be untangled. And somewhere in Mayfair, behind locked doors and hushed voices, a story had already begun. Eleanor Greaves turned the small deep blue wax seal between her fingers, noting how it had been pressed with deliberate precision, an unnecessary flourish, meant to convey importance. It was from Scotland Yard. Such letters rarely bore good news. They came from those who wrote only when absolutely necessary, and when they did, they brought a certain weight with them. But Eleanor was not the kind to let unease settle in before its time. She set the letter beside her chair, and took a slow sip of her tea. Everything in life had its moment, and reading an official summons was best done with a clear mind. The scent of freshly brewed tea, mingled with the crisp air outside, where the village hummed with quiet industry, shopkeepers tending their stalls, a distant neigh from the livery yard, a child's laughter floating through the morning. These were the small steady rhythms of life. Yet Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the letter, its presence a silent disruption to the peaceful morning. At last she unfolded the note with careful hands, as though it contained not just words, but something fragile, something meant to be unraveled, rather than simply read. The message was as she had expected. Miss Greaves, a most pressing matter has arisen. Sir Lucius Fairchild, a man of considerable wealth and influence, yet known for his quiet intellect, has been found dead under unusual circumstances. The cause remains unclear, yet suspicion grows like a shadow over the entire affair. Your reputation for uncovering the unseen precedes you, and I must ask for your assistance. Arrangements have been made for your immediate travel. This is not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a truth to be uncovered, one that only a keen mind can reveal. Yours sincerely, Inspector Aldous Hargreaves, Scotland Yard. Eleanor folded the letter once more, yet her mind was already elsewhere. Lucius Fairchild was not just another name. His presence carried weight, his absence even more so. And now, he was dead, under unusual circumstances. The words lingered in her mind like the cold tendrils of a creeping fog. She took one last sip of tea, and for the first time in a long while, felt the stirrings of intrigue. London was a world apart from the countryside, she knew so well. The village required only the changing winds to transform itself, but London was a different creature altogether, deeper, more elusive. And most dangerous of all, Eleanor knew that once a thought took root in her mind, it was not easily shaken. The bustle of Victoria Station greeted her with the thick scent of coal smoke and damp wool, the clamour of hurried footsteps, and the ever-present press of bodies moving in relentless currents. This was a city that swallowed people whole. A uniformed officer, clearly recognizing her, stepped forward with a polite nod. "Miss Greaves, we've been expecting you." Expectation. The world was always waiting for something, for someone. She returned his nod with a small, knowing smile. But the real mystery had only just begun. Was Sir Lucius Fairchild's death merely an unfortunate incident, or was it the first ripple in a much deeper conspiracy, hidden behind the heavy curtains of London's grand houses. In a city where every locked door concealed a story, Eleanor had only one task before her: to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Lady Evelyn Harcourt stepped over the threshold of the dimly lit study, her gloved hands resting lightly against the polished mahogany doorframe. The scent of aged paper and pipe smoke clung to the air, mingling with the sharper, unmistakable metallic tang of blood. The room, once an impeccable display of wealth and order, had been thrown into disarray, shelves half emptied, a shattered brandy decanter soaking into the Persian rug, a grandfather clock stopped dead at 11:43. But what drew her gaze, steady and calculating, was the man slumped in the leather armchair, his silk waistcoat marred by a deep crimson bloom. Lord Sebastian Aldwych, wealthy financier, political whisperer, and a man who had made as many enemies as he had fortunes, was very much dead. The gaslight flickered slightly as Inspector Calloway stepped in behind her, his heavy boots muffled by the thick carpeting. "Locked from the inside," he said grimly, gesturing toward the bolted door, and the grand windows sealed shut against the night. "No sign of forced entry. Every guest downstairs swears they saw nothing, heard nothing," he exhaled sharply. "But we both know that's rarely the truth." Lady Evelyn nodded absently, her gaze sweeping over the scene with practiced detachment. The spilled brandy, the ink-stained fingers of the corpse, the faint trace of perfume that did not belong to the Lord's famously austere wife. A mystery unraveled itself in fragments, each detail a whisper of something hidden just beneath the surface. She stepped closer, ignoring the discomfort of Calloway's watchful stare. "A single gunshot wound," she murmured, leaning in, close range, and yet her fingers ghosted over the armrest, where faint indentations marked the place where Lord Aldwich's fingers had last pressed. "No weapon," Calloway confirmed darkly. "And no gunpowder residue on his hands. He didn't shoot himself." A puzzle then, a locked room, a vanished weapon, and a man killed in the heart of his own fortress. The study held secrets beyond the obvious, but Evelyn had long known that the most damning clues were rarely the ones people looked for. She turned sharply on her heel. "Where is the household staff?" "The butler, Reynolds, is waiting in the servants' hall," Calloway said, rubbing his jaw. "A loyal man, been with the Aldwych nearly If anyone knew the undercurrents of this house, it's him." Evelyn inclined her head. "Then let's not keep him waiting." Reynolds sat rigid-backed at the long oak table in the dim servants' quarters, his posture a study in well-practiced composure. A man who had spent his life in the quiet shadows of power, unnoticed yet ever watchful. Evelyn took the chair opposite him, her gloved fingers tracing the delicate rim of the teacup placed before her. "A terrible thing," she said softly, watching him. "Lord Aldwich's murder." The butler inclined his head. "Indeed, madam, but not an unexpected one." The words were barely a whisper, yet they hung between them with the weight of a gun cocked in the dark. For the first time, Reynolds' stoic mask faltered, if only for a fraction of a second. "My lady," Evelyn leaned in, her voice as cool as it was assured. "A man like Aldwych does not die in an isolated accident, Mr. Reynolds. He dies when his debts come due, when the secrets he has buried refuse to stay that way. So tell me, what did he fear, and who in this house had a reason to see him dead?" A pause, a flicker of something sharp in the butler's gaze, and then just barely, the corner of his mouth twitched downward. "People," he murmured, "are rarely what they seem, madam." Evelyn sat back, a slow smile ghosting her lips. Yes, now at last, they were getting somewhere. The grandfather clock in the great hall of Hawthorne Manor let out a hollow, resonant chime, midnight. The hour of truth, the hour of reckoning. The air in the estate was thick with something unseen. Something heavier than candle smoke or the crisp winter chill that pressed against the locked windows. It was the kind of silence that followed an irreversible act, the kind that whispered of murder. Lady Beatrice Wren sat with meticulous poise in the dimly lit drawing room, her gloved hands folded neatly over the armrest of a high-backed chair. Across from her, James Whitmore, the butler of 30 years, maintained a carefully neutral expression, though his fingers twitched slightly against the polished mahogany table between them. The room, with its grand velvet drapes and oil paintings of unsmiling ancestors, had witnessed many whispered conspiracies, but tonight's conversation carried the weight of something far more sinister. "A dreadful business," Lady Wren murmured, her voice as smooth as silk yet edged with something sharp. And yet, somehow not entirely surprising, Whitmore's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something recognition perhaps passed behind his eyes. "Indeed, madam," he said at last, his voice level, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Lady Wren let it linger, studying the way the butler sat, too still, too composed. Then, with the ease of someone setting a chess piece into place, she posed her next question. Where was Lady Eleanor when the shot was fired? A hesitation, subtle, but telling. "In her rooms, madam," Whitmore answered at last. The phrasing was precise. Not in the drawing room, not in the presence of others, just in her rooms. How convenient. Lady Wren did not react, but something in her mind clicked into place. She had always believed that the most damning evidence was never the grand statements, it was the details, the careful omissions, the spaces between the words. The scent of aged parchment and candle wax filled the servants' hall, where Lady Wren now sat across from Mrs. Lockwood, the housekeeper, a woman with sharp, bird-like features and a perpetually pinched expression. Mrs. Lockwood carried the air of someone who always suspected a catastrophe was lurking just beyond her sight. "A terrible thing," the housekeeper sighed, her hands folded primly in her lap. "Simply terrible. But if you ask me, madam, it was bound to happen sooner or later." Lady Wren lifted an eyebrow. "Indeed," Mrs. Lockwood pursed her lips. "Not that I would speak ill of the dead, but Lord Hawthorne, well, he was a man who valued control. And men like that," she added, lowering her voice as though the very walls were listening, "do not take kindly to losing it." Lady Wren tilted her head ever so slightly. "Losing control." The words hovered in the air like a ghost. The housekeeper hesitated, but there was something in Lady Wren's gaze that compelled honesty. His wife, Mrs. Lockwood, murmured at last. "Lady Eleanor, it's no secret, madam, she had ideas of her own." "Ideas?" Lady Wren asked, her tone deceptively mild. Lockwood's fingers twisted in her lap. "Politics, business, the running of things. And Sir Hawthorne, he did not approve." There had been arguments then, possibly more. Lady Wren sat back, her mind weaving threads into an ever-tightening net. Lord Hawthorne had been a man who held power, and someone had taken it from him, violently, permanently. But was it his wife, a woman tired of being silenced, or was there another player in this deadly game? Someone lurking in the shadows, their hands still dusted with gunpowder. By the time she stepped out into the dim corridors of Hawthorne Manor once more, Lady Wren had already begun to see the shape of the truth. The whisper of fabric against polished wood, the click of a distant door, the scent of cold metal, all details that did not lie. Somewhere in this house, a murderer sat in perfect stillness, waiting. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated Lady Beatrice Wren. The flickering glow of the fireplace cast long, restless shadows along the panelled walls of Blackwood House. A grandfather clock in the corner marked the hour with a deep, resonant chime, though its slow, deliberate ticking had already begun to feel like the pulse of something unseen, something dark, inevitable. Seated in the grand drawing-room, Lady Evelyn Harrow maintained an air of quiet composure, her fingers lightly grazing the rim of a delicate porcelain teacup. Across from her, Lord Raymond Sinclair leaned against the fireplace mantel, his expression one of measured detachment, though the tension in his jaw betrayed something less indifferent. Between them, Inspector Alistair Grayson sat with his hands clasped over one knee, his sharp eyes assessing, dissecting. He had seen rooms like this before, rooms where wealth and power draped themselves in civility, concealing the rot beneath. "I trust you are finding your accommodations comfortable, Lady Evelyn," Lord Sinclair said at last, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Quite," she replied mildly, taking a sip of her tea. Sinclair exhaled in a way that suggested the matter of her comfort was a frivolous detour. "I understand," he continued, turning his gaze toward Grayson, "that you have been brought in to assist with the investigation. A rather unorthodox decision, wouldn't you say?" The question was not directed at her but at Grayson, as though hoping someone would acknowledge the absurdity of it. Grayson, to his credit, did not so much as blink. "Lady Evelyn's insights have already proven invaluable," he said evenly. Lord Sinclair's smile was thin, unimpressed. "I see," he murmured, his gaze settling on her at last. "Do you often find yourself entangled in matters of this nature, Lady Evelyn?" She tilted her head slightly. "Only when they happen inconveniently close to my afternoon tea, my lord." There was a brief pause. Grayson coughed, whether in amusement or discomfort, it was difficult to say. Lord Sinclair did not smile. "I'm afraid this is a delicate affair," Sinclair continued. "Lord Blackwood was a man of considerable standing, as all murder victims tend to be, to someone," Lady Evelyn observed, her expression unreadable. Grayson watched as Sinclair's lips pressed into a thin line, but it was Chief Superintendent Marcus Enderby, who had been listening in silence, that finally spoke. "Since you've been invited to share your perspective, Lady Evelyn, what do you make of it all?" She adjusted the lace cuff of her glove with careful precision. "It is a peculiar thing, Superintendent, how a murder can be both expected and shocking at once." Enderby frowned. "Expected? Oh, I do not mean in the literal sense," she said, offering an apologetic smile. "But I find that men who make enemies rarely have the luxury of dying peacefully in their beds." A shadow flickered across Sinclair's face. "And you assume Lord Blackwood had enemies?" Lady Evelyn folded her hands neatly in her lap. "A man of wealth and influence. I would assume nothing else." Grayson nodded slightly, as though she had merely voiced a thought already forming in his own mind. "There are potential motives," he admitted. His business dealings were far-reaching, and not without controversy. His political connections, too, may have created certain tensions. "And of course," Lady Evelyn murmured, "there is always the matter of personal affairs." Enderby's brow furrowed. "His personal affairs?" She inclined her head thoughtfully. "People rarely confine their grudges to business or politics alone, Superintendent. There are other considerations, pride, resentment, the matters of the heart, and of course the ever-present temptation of wealth." The words hung in the air, and she watched how each man reacted to them. Lord Sinclair remained impassive, though his fingers tightened slightly around the head of his cane. Grayson's expression was carefully neutral, while Enderby shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "One might say," she continued, her voice soft yet deliberate, "that the real question is not whether Lord Blackwood had enemies, but rather which of them was the most impatient." A brief silence followed. Sinclair exhaled sharply. "I do hope, Lady Evelyn, that you do not intend to indulge in gossip and scandal. Discretion is paramount in these matters." "Discretion," she said with a small smile, "is a wonderful thing, my lord, but it is rarely a friend to justice." Sinclair regarded her for a long moment, then turned his attention back to Grayson. "Inspector, I trust you will keep this matter contained. The last thing we need is unnecessary speculation." Grayson's expression remained unreadable. "Of course." Sinclair gave Lady Evelyn one firm measured glance before rising from his seat. "I must return to my estate. Keep me informed." And with that he was gone. Enderby lingered a moment longer, rubbing his temple as though this entire affair was an uninvited headache. He shook his head slightly before following Sinclair out the door. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, Grayson turned to Lady Evelyn. "He doesn't like you." She smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I don't imagine he dislikes me personally, Inspector. I am simply an inconvenience. The truth, you see, tends to be dreadfully untidy." Grayson sighed, running a hand over his chin. "You're not wrong about Blackwood. He had secrets. The question is whether one of them was worth killing for." Lady Evelyn retrieved her handbag and rose gracefully to her feet. "Oh, I do think so, Inspector," she said kindly. "The trick, you see, is determining which secret someone was desperate enough to keep." Grayson watched as she moved toward the door, her steps unhurried, her demeanor serene, and yet, as he had already come to suspect, there was nothing casual about her presence here. Lady Evelyn Harrow was not merely observing the storm, she was already tracing its path, and when the truth emerged, she would be standing at the very eye of it. The study at Ashworth Manor bore the weight of centuries, oak-panelled walls steeped in whispered betrayals, a fireplace that had warmed generations of power-hungry men, and heavy drapes that seemed to conspire against the moonlight, letting only fractured slivers of silver spill onto the Persian rug. It was in this room, this chamber of influence and secrecy, that Lord Benedict Harrow had drawn his final breath. His lifeless body slumped forward over his grand mahogany desk, the deep crimson of his own blood, stark against the ivory parchment beneath him. The gunshot had been clean, precise, deliberate. Not an act of passion, but one of calculated intent. Inspector Alden stood near the door, his keen eyes sweeping the space with the measured patience of a man accustomed to untangling deception. His gaze lingered on the details, the brandy glass shattered near Lord Harrow's right hand, the ink pot tipped over, its contents bleeding into an unfinished letter, and the faint scent of gunpowder still clinging to the air like an unspoken confession. A singular line of text, half obscured by spilled ink, had survived. "If you proceed with this, I cannot," and then nothing. Had the sentence been cut short by the fatal shot, or had someone ensured the message would remain incomplete? Lady Eleanor Harrow stood by the hearth, her silhouette tense against the glow of dying embers. Draped in an elegance that did little to conceal the stiffness in her spine, she did not weep, nor did she lower her gaze. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on the fire, watching the flames as though seeking answers within their shifting shapes. "This house," she murmured, more to herself than to the room, "has always belonged to shadows." Across from her, Roland Hayward, a long-time associate of the deceased, and a man of unsettling composure, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored coat. He was the sort of man who rarely spoke, unless he had weighed his words like currency, and when he finally did, his voice was devoid of any real sorrow. "A tragic loss," he said, though the weight of his grief was suspiciously light. Miss Meredith Vale, ever poised, sat in a high-backed chair near the center of the room, her gloved fingers resting upon the armrest as she regarded the scene before her. Unlike the others, she did not avert her gaze from the body. "Curious, isn't it?" she said finally, her voice lilting with quiet amusement. "Not a single person has claimed to have seen him in the 10 minutes before the shot was fired. And yet, I imagine every soul in this house was aware that Lord Harrow rarely spent his evenings alone." Inspector Alden turned to the butler, Mr. Linwood, who had recounted his version of events with the careful precision of a man who knew the weight of his words. "His lordship was in his study all evening," Linwood had said, "until just before the clock struck 10. Yet Miss Tilling, the housemaid, had spoken of muffled voices in the corridor at precisely that time, voices that had grown heated before falling into silence. Someone was lying. And yet," Miss Vale continued, adjusting the lace at her wrist, "it is not the presence of conflicting accounts that intrigues me, Inspector, but rather the absence of one singular truth. No one, it seems, is willing to say precisely where they were in the final moments before the shot rang out." Inspector Alden exhaled slowly. "You imply, madam, that we are dealing not just with murder, but with an entire structure of deceit." Miss Vale tilted her head slightly, a ghost of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. Inspector, I should think that much is obvious. Lord Harrow was a man who collected debts, not all of them monetary. Her fingers skimmed over the ink-stained letter, as if feeling for the ghost of its words. The question is not merely who wished him dead, but who among them had finally lost the patience to wait. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with unspoken accusations. Outside, the estate's great clock chimed, marking the passing of another hour, an hour that had slipped by like a noose tightening around the truth. The Harrington estate stood like a silent sentinel against the night, its vast stone facade bathed in the pale glow of gas lamps, the great iron gates creaking ever so slightly in the wind as if whispering secrets from centuries past. Within its towering walls, where velvet drapes hung heavy with the dust of old money and old sins, the air was thick with the scent of cigars, brandy, and something far more elusive, fear. The ballroom, a cathedral of excess, pulsed with the murmur of champagne-fueled conversations, the shimmer of beaded gowns, and the soft chime of crystal against gold-rimmed glasses. The music from the grand orchestra swelled and receded like the tide, yet beneath its melody lurked the undercurrent of something darker, something unsaid, something unfinished. Into this gilded web of whispers and veiled glances stepped Evelyn Harcourt. Dressed in emerald silk that clung to her form with an elegance too refined to be an accident, she moved with the poise of a woman accustomed to being watched yet never truly seen. But tonight, she was not here for admiration. She was here for answers. Her gaze swept the ballroom with practiced indifference, noting the small tells that most overlooked, a financier gripping his drink a little too tightly, a diplomat laughing just a second too late. A woman in a feathered stole whose eyes darted toward the grand staircase before quickly looking away. And then there was him, Alistair Graves, tall, composed, the kind of man whose presence was felt before he even spoke. He stood near a gilded pillar, a half-smile curving his lips as he entertained a group of society's most influential players, his sharp gaze calculating even as he feigned amusement. His reputation was one of whispered deals and untraceable transactions, of power wielded in rooms where no records were kept. If there was a man who knew what had truly happened to Lord James Harrington, it was him. Evelyn approached, her voice honeyed but firm. "Mr. Graves." He turned to her with the precision of a man who was never caught off guard. "Miss Harcourt. What an unexpected pleasure." "I doubt it's unexpected." She tilted her head ever so slightly. "After all, you were expecting someone tonight, weren't you? Perhaps someone who never arrived." His expression did not falter, but she saw the flicker of something in his eyes, amusement, annoyance, interest. "Curious," he murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You speak as if you already know the answer." "I know that Lord Harrington had an urgent meeting scheduled the night he died, a meeting with someone he trusted just enough to let his guard down." Graves exhaled through his nose, his smile never wavering. "And you believe that someone was me?" "I believe," Evelyn said, stepping closer, lowering her voice just enough that he alone could hear, "that Lord Harrington's death was not merely a matter of misfortune, nor a crime of passion. It was an execution. The question is, was it personal, or was it business?" Graves regarded her for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle, a sound entirely devoid of warmth. "You do ask dangerous questions, Miss Harcourt." "I find that the most dangerous questions tend to lead to the most important answers." For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. The laughter, the music, the glittering display of society's finest, and all that remained was the unspoken challenge between them. Evelyn Harcourt knew she was standing on the precipice of something vast, something that had cost one man his life, and would not hesitate to claim another. But the truth was a relentless thing, and tonight she intended to unearth it, no matter how many shadows she had to walk through to find it. Blackthorn Manor loomed in the mist, like a spectre of its own past. its ivy-clad walls drinking in the faint glow of the gas lamps lining the gravel driveway. The night held its breath, thick with the scent of damp earth and buried secrets, as a procession of gleaming automobiles purred to a stop before the grand entrance. Inside, the chandeliered halls shimmered with excess, gloved hands cradling crystal flutes, laughter polished to perfection, and the rhythmic sway of dancers caught in a waltz that masked the tension lurking beneath. To the untrained eye, it was a night of revelry. To Evelyn Graves, it was a tableau of hidden motives, a stage where masks were worn not just on faces, but in every carefully measured glance, every lingering touch, every smile stretched just a fraction too tight. She moved through the crowd with effortless poise, her gown of midnight blue silk blending seamlessly with the shifting shadows cast by gilded candelabras. The air was thick with unspoken alliances and concealed debts. A countess, her laugh too bright, twirled the stem of her glass between painted fingers. A young man, his brow damp despite the chill, clutched a cigarette with trembling hands. A politician, his gaze flickering toward the doors, seemed just a little too eager to leave. And then there was him, Sebastian Blackthorne, the enigmatic heir to an empire built on old money and older sins. Tall, with a presence that seemed to darken the very air around him, he stood near the marble fireplace, speaking in smooth measured tones to a group of men whose faces bore the calm calculation of those who dealt in power rather than pleasantries. Evelyn had no doubt that he knew far more about what had truly happened to Lord Hawthorne than he let on. She approached with deliberate poise, her voice carrying the quiet authority that demanded attention. "Mr. Blackthorne," he turned, his gaze sharp, assessing. "Miss Graves." A slow, knowing smile curled at the edges of his lips. "What an unexpected pleasure. I somehow doubt it's unexpected," she murmured, tilting her head ever so slightly. After all, one must always anticipate guests who arrive seeking answers. His expression did not falter, but in the flickering firelight, she caught the barest twitch of his fingers against the crystal glass he held. "And what answers do you seek?" "The kind that tend to be inconvenient," she said, her tone light, almost conversational, yet laced with something sharper. "Lord Hawthorne's death was no accident. We both know that." Sebastian exhaled softly, a ghost of amusement in his gaze. "A bold claim. A true one," she countered smoothly. "The real question is, was his death an unfortunate necessity, or was it a warning?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes, something colder, something lethal. Then just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the practiced ease of a man accustomed to keeping his secrets well guarded. "You do ask dangerous questions, Miss Graves. I find those are the only ones worth asking." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant chime of a clock. Midnight. The air in the room seemed to shift, tension rippling beneath the surface of laughter and clinking glasses. Somewhere, a hushed conversation cut off abruptly. A glance exchanged in the corner carried more weight than words, and in the shadows of the grand staircase, Evelyn caught sight of something or someone, disappearing behind the heavy oak doors of Lord Hawthorne's private study. Her pulse quickened. With an unreadable smile, she turned back to Blackthorne. "Do excuse me," she said lightly. "I do believe there's something I must see for myself." She stepped away, weaving through the crowd with the precision of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The moment she crossed the threshold of the dimly lit corridor, the revelry of the ballroom faded into a muffled hum. Here, the walls whispered of things unseen, of meetings held in secret, of deals struck in the hush of candlelight. As she neared the study, the scent of aged parchment and leather mingled with something else, something metallic, something unmistakably tinged with iron. Blood. Evelyn hesitated only for a moment before pressing her gloved hand against the door and pushing it open. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows over the vast mahogany desk strewn with documents, a glass of unfinished scotch, and most damning of all, a single glove, discarded, near the edge of the Persian rug, where a dark stain had begun to seep into the fabric. She exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling in. Murder was never just about death, it was about control, about silencing the wrong voices, about ensuring certain truths remained buried. And tonight, amidst the golden glow of chandeliers and the carefully curated laughter of the elite, Evelyn Graves had uncovered a truth that someone had been willing to kill for. The only question that remained was, who would be next? The death of Lord Everett Blackwood was beginning to show its cracks, and Evelyn Harcourt knew that the right pressure in the right places would be all it took to fracture the facade entirely. Back in the opulent warmth of Blackwood Hall's main drawing room, the grand gala carried on, its attendees moving like carefully placed chess pieces, polished, poised, yet undeniably strategic. Laughter sparkled in the candlelight, the clinking of crystal glasses mingling with the strains of a waltz played by a hidden orchestra. But Evelyn, seated amidst the seemingly harmless murmurs of brandy and cigar smoke, knew better than to be fooled by the illusion. She observed, detached but keen, as the host Lord Alistair Montrose swirled his drink with feigned ease, though his fingers curled just a little too tightly around the glass. Across from him sat Sir Reginald Ashworth, a man whose quiet authority did not need grandiosity to be felt, his presence alone enough to make Montrose's carefully constructed calm waver. "Really, must we dwell on such morbid affairs?" Montrose said, an attempt at nonchalant smoothing his voice. "Everett's passing was unfortunate, of course, but we must allow the man his rest." Evelyn, having witnessed many such desperate attempts to shift focus away from uncomfortable truths, merely offered a small knowing smile. "Death," she murmured, "is rarely as cooperative as we would like. It has a way of lingering, a flicker of tightness around Montrose's mouth." Beside him, Sir Reginald exhaled, his gaze heavy with consideration. "Curious, isn't it?" he mused, "the manner of his death. A man like Blackwood, one would expect if he were to meet an untimely end, it would be on foreign soil, not within the sanctuary of his own estate." The statement rippled through the gathered few, a murmur of agreement laced with the unspoken question no one dared voice outright. Evelyn's sharp gaze flitted over them all. Lucian Aldridge, ever the silent observer, his face an unreadable mask. Lady Isabel Blackwood, the late lord's widow, outwardly composed but gripping the stem of her champagne flute just a fraction too tightly. And then, Montrose made the fatal mistake. "You speak as though it were an assassination," he said, too quickly, too definitively. The words landed with the weight of a gunshot, and the room tensed. Evelyn set her teacup down with deliberate softness. "Now why," she asked mildly, "would that be the first thought that came to your mind?" Montrose recovered, but not quickly enough. A chuckle, just slightly forced. "Purely an observation, Miss Harcourt," he deflected, lifting his glass as though to mask the moment. One could fashion any number of elaborate theories if they were inclined toward drama. Sir Reginald studied him for a beat longer before nodding. "Elaborate theories indeed," he murmured. "And yet men like Blackwood do not die without a reason." Finally Aldridge spoke, his voice smooth but laced with careful calculation. "If there is a reason, surely it is a personal one: money, jealousy, betrayal, the usual suspects. Why look beyond that?" Evelyn turned her gaze toward the flickering candlelight, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of what had just been said settle into the room's golden silence. "Because," she said quietly, "it is often what we dismiss too quickly that turns out to be the truth." The tension shifted, subtle but unmistakable. From the corner of her eye she caught it. Lady Isabel parting her lips as if to speak, then thinking better of it. Evelyn noted it, tucked it away. There was something here, something unsaid, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. That night, as the revelry continued, Evelyn found herself in the dimly lit corridors of Aldridge House, where wealth was displayed not in excess, but in precision, tall, dignified facades, heavy drapery concealing more than just the warm glow of candlelight. Inside, the silence was curated, the air thick with the scent of old books and expensive cologne. Lucian Aldridge, ever the gracious host, led her into an intimate dining room, where a table was set for two beneath a glittering chandelier. The setting was not grand but deliberate: soft candlelight, gleaming silverware, a carafe of vintage Bordeaux poured with quiet efficiency by an unseen servant. The scent of seared duck and rosemary lingered in the air, but Evelyn had the distinct impression that she was meant to be the one placed under scrutiny tonight. "A small gathering," Aldridge said smoothly, pulling out a chair for her. "I find that meaningful conversation is best had away from the noise of an audience." Evelyn accepted the seat with a gracious nod. "How very considerate of you." For a while, their conversation remained pleasant, harmless remarks about the changing seasons, the chef's impeccable skill, the inevitable dullness of high society's grand affairs. But then, quite suddenly, the air between them shifted. Aldridge leaned forward just slightly, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his wineglass. "Tell me, Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice as soft as the candlelight, "are you always this?" He paused, choosing his word with care. "Curious." Evelyn smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Curiosity," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine, "is simply another word for interest, and I find people endlessly interesting." A beat of silence, then a low knowing chuckle. "Then you must find this affair terribly fascinating." "Undeniably." She set her glass down, meeting his gaze directly. "I do wonder, Mr. Aldridge, what do you think truly happened to Lord Blackwood?" Something shifted in his expression, so slight it could have been imagined. But Evelyn was well versed in reading men like Lucian Aldridge. The game was well underway now, and she intended to play it to its very end. Lord Benedict Warrington reclined in his chair, the flickering firelight casting shifting shadows across his sharp, calculating features. Across from him, Eleanor Graves held her glass of wine with deliberate ease, her expression composed, her mind anything but. There was something about Warrington, a quiet, predatory patience, as though he were waiting for the right moment to strike. "You are a most remarkable woman, Miss Graves," Warrington observed, his voice smooth, almost idle, as he traced the rim of his glass with one long finger. Eleanor set down her spoon with an air of practiced nonchalance. "I do hope that is not a prelude to flattery, Lord Warrington. I find it has a most unpleasant effect on my digestion." Warrington chuckled, but the amusement never quite reached his eyes. "Not flattery," he mused. "Simply an observation." "How reassuring," Eleanor murmured, tilting her head slightly. "You possess," he continued, watching her carefully, "a rare gift, an ability to see beyond the illusions that most people so carefully construct. That must be rather inconvenient at times." Eleanor's smile was faint, but unwavering. "Not at all. I find it rather useful." Warrington studied her for a long moment before taking a slow sip of his wine. His grey eyes gleamed, somewhere between curiosity and calculation. "We live in a world of delicate balances, Miss Graves. The men who hold power, whether in business, politics or society, do not do so by accident. They understand the rules of the game." He gestured vaguely with his glass, "and they play accordingly." Eleanor's expression did not change. How fortunate for them. Warrington tilted his head slightly. Sir Harold Dunham played the game quite well, in fact, until he didn't. A small silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. Eleanor stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Tell me, Lord Warrington, do you believe his failure was a miscalculation? Or was it simply an inevitable consequence?" Warrington's lips curved into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I believe, Miss Graves, that some men make the mistake of thinking themselves untouchable." Eleanor met his gaze with quiet interest. "And is it your opinion that such men deserve their fate?" Warrington did not answer immediately. Instead he swirled the deep red wine in his glass, watching the liquid coat the sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost regretful. I believe that men who fail to understand the nature of power often find themselves at the mercy of those who do. Eleanor took a final sip of her tea, an interesting answer, and perhaps a most telling one. After dinner, Warrington led her into a smaller study, where the dim lighting and deep leather armchairs created an atmosphere of quiet conspiracy. The fire crackled in the great hearth, casting flickering shadows across the mahogany-paneled walls. Warrington poured them each a small measure of brandy, before settling into a chair opposite her. "You are an exceptional woman, Miss Graves," he said after a moment. Eleanor accepted the glass, but did not drink. "That is very kind of you to say. I do not say it idly." Warrington regarded her over the rim of his glass. "A mind such as yours must find its limitations rather frustrating." Eleanor arched a delicate brow. "Limitations," he smiled faintly. "You solve puzzles, Miss Graves. You see what others miss, but you do so from the outside looking in. Imagine what you could achieve were you positioned differently." Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. "What an intriguing notion." Warrington leaned forward slightly, his expression one of genuine curiosity. "Have you never wished to be a part of something greater? To understand how the world truly works, not as it appears to those on the outside, but from within?" Eleanor set her glass down gently on the table. "I find the world works precisely as it always has, Lord Warrington, with the same ambitions, the same desires, and the same unfortunate consequences." Warrington studied her for a long moment before exhaling. "You are remarkable, Miss Graves." Her smile was gentle. "Oh, I should think not." He stood then, moving to the fireplace, his gaze thoughtful. "Men like Sir Harold," he murmured, "sometimes forget that there are rules even for them." Eleanor rose as well. "And men like you, Lord Warrington." He turned, offering her a small knowing smile. "Men like me ensure that the game is played fairly." Eleanor chuckled softly. How very reassuring. A silence stretched between them. There was, she knew, an invitation in his words, a suggestion that there was a world beyond what she saw, a world where power was a currency far more valuable than truth. For a fleeting moment she considered it. There was after all a certain allure to knowing how the game was truly played. The night air carried the distant chime of a clock tower as Eleanor Graves stepped from the carriage, her gaze sweeping across the imposing facade of Harrington House. Inside, behind velvet-draped windows and walls lined with oil paintings, whispered bargains were being struck, the kind that shifted fortunes and sealed fates. She was expected, but not necessarily welcome. Lord Sebastian Whitmore had extended the invitation with the air of a man offering a chess opponent one last move, yet Eleanor knew that in this particular game, the board had already been set long before her arrival. As she entered the grand hall, a butler led her to a dimly lit drawing room where a fire flickered in the hearth, its glow illuminating a crystal decanter half filled with amber liquid. Lord Whitmore reclined in a high-backed chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his glass. "Miss Graves," he murmured, his voice smooth as silk yet edged with something sharper. "Punctual as always." Eleanor smiled faintly, unfastening her gloves with deliberate ease. "I find that punctuality is a habit of those who dislike surprises." Whitmore chuckled, though there was no real amusement in it. "Then I suspect you will not enjoy what I have to say." She met his gaze evenly. "That remains to be seen." He studied her for a long moment before setting his drink aside and leaning forward. "You see, Miss Graves, power is not merely possessed, it is maintained, curated, wielded with precision. Those who fail to grasp this truth find themselves displaced." He gestured vaguely, as if to indicate some invisible force beyond the firelight. Sir Adrian Blackthorne understood that, until he didn't. Eleanor's fingers stilled against the silk of her gown. How unfortunate for him. A miscalculation, Whitmore said, pouring himself another drink. Or perhaps merely an inevitable consequence. She inclined her head slightly, her expression unreadable, And do you believe such men deserve their fate? Whitmore swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the liquid catch the fire's glow. When he spoke, his tone was almost regretful. I believe that those who forget the rules of the game often find themselves at the mercy of those who do not. Eleanor took a measured breath, a most illuminating perspective. The conversation shifted, but the undercurrent remained, subtle yet unmistakable. Whitmore was not merely speaking of the past, he was warning her of the present, and the weight of his words settled in the space between them like a blade resting just above the skin. Later, as she stepped into the crisp London night, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever game was being played, she was no longer just an observer. She was now a piece upon the board. The archive chamber at Langley Square was not a place meant for visitors. It was a fortress of paper and ink, where power was pressed between pages and secrets were bound in ledgers. Eleanor stood at the threshold, listening. Silence. Satisfied, she slipped inside, moving with quiet precision. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of aged parchment and dust. Mahogany shelves stretched along the walls, their spines marked not by titles but by codes, each one a key to a truth that was never meant to be spoken. She ran her fingers along the rows, searching, and then there, a ledger, its cover unassuming but its contents anything but. She opened it, her pulse steady as she scanned the columns. Numbers, names, transactions buried beneath layers of careful obfuscation, but patterns did not lie. Her breath caught slightly as she found it, a sum vast and deliberate, transferred mere weeks before Sir Adrian's demise. The recipient, an offshore account linked to the initials A.W. Arthur Whitmore. She exhaled slowly. So the elegant Lord Whitmore had more than words to offer. He had a reason to ensure Adrian Blackthorne's silence. A bribe, a payoff, or something more permanent. The answers lay deeper, buried beneath missing entries and ink-stained erasures. But before she could read further, a sound, the faintest creak of floorboards beyond the door. Eleanor's instincts sharpened. With practiced ease, she closed the ledger and returned it to its place, ensuring every detail of the desk was precisely as she had found it. Then she stepped into the shadows. The door cracked open, just enough for a figure to peer inside. She did not move. A pause, a breath. Then the door clicked shut. Whoever had been watching knew that someone had been here, but for now, they did not know it was her. Eleanor released a slow breath. Time was running out. The Imperial Club was a place where deals were not spoken, only understood, where fortunes changed over the clink of glasses and lives were bartered like currency. The upper floors were for gentlemen, for the trappings of civility, brandy, cigars, discussions of trade. The lower rooms, however, were for something else entirely. She descended the marble staircase, her gown a whisper against the cold stone. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, whiskey, and something far less tangible, secrecy. Beyond a half-open door, voices murmured. She stepped inside. The gathering was small, yet significant. Seated comfortably by the fire, Arthur Whitmore regarded her with the faintest hint of amusement. Across the room, Lord Dunhurst, his usual air of quiet composure, edged with something tighter, something frayed, and between them, a space left empty. A chair unoccupied, a place meant for her. Eleanor Graves did not sit. Instead she met Whitmore's gaze and smiled, a polite, practiced smile, the kind one offered an opponent before the game truly began. A dense fog blanketed the London night as Eleanor Graves stood at the gilded doors of Cavendish Manor, among the select few invited, not merely to a ball, but to a silent reckoning. Inside, beneath the golden glow of chandeliers, faces gleamed with carefully curated smiles, their laughter precise, their secrets heavier than the air thick with champagne. This was not just a celebration, it was a battlefield where no swords were drawn, no shots fired, only words, glances, and the quiet weight of concealed truths that never truly died. Eleanor lifted her glass, but her gaze remained fixed on Sir Rowland, who stood near the mahogany bar, engaged in a hushed exchange with Lucian Fairfax. "Miss Graves," a familiar voice intruded, Lord Ashcombe, his ever-smiling face betraying nothing. "I was hoping you'd make an appearance." Eleanor offered a subtle, practiced smile, yet her mind was elsewhere, on a man she had not seen before. He stood near the velvet curtains, cradling a whiskey glass, watching her with an unsettling kind of stillness. His suit was immaculate, as if not a single thread in his life had ever been out of place. Eleanor knew men like him did not come merely to observe, they came to play. Ashcombe swirled his champagne, his voice edged with something unreadable. "You do love to wade into deep waters, don't you?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, the ghost of a smirk on her lips. "It's only deep if you don't know how to swim, my lord." There was steel beneath her words, and Ashcombe knew it, but the real game of the night had only just begun. Lord Ashcombe raised his glass for a toast, to truth, and to those who dare seek it. The room fell into a hush. Eleanor took a slow sip of her champagne, yet before the glass touched her lips, she felt it, a chill that traced up her spine, a whisper of danger lingering just behind her, and then a quiet voice, measured and deliberate. "Miss Graves, I would advise you to tread carefully. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." It was him. The nameless man now stood at her back. Eleanor exhaled softly, tilting her chin down in quiet acknowledgement. Her voice was light, yet the weight of her words undeniable. "Then I shall just have to ensure that when I walk through, I do not walk alone. There comes a moment when a murder is no longer just a crime but a signal, a shift in the balance of power, and when the ones who conceal it begin to fall, one by one, the real danger is no longer in uncovering the truth. It is in surviving it." Eleanor Graves was no longer just an observer, she was part of the game now, and in a world of wealth, power, and carefully kept secrets, those who played too well often didn't live long enough to win. The hush that fell over Blackwood Hall was deafening, the kind of silence that carried the weight of unseen forces shifting beneath the surface. Eleanor Graves stood in the center of it all, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the polished oak of the witness stand, her expression as composed as ever despite the undercurrents of danger curling around her like unseen tendrils. Across the room Lord Harrington, his face a study in carefully cultivated neutrality, adjusted his cufflinks with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who knew the power of theatrics. "Miss Graves," he began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "one might argue that you have a certain proclivity for involving yourself in matters that do not concern you." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, punctuated by the scratch of a journalist's pen. Eleanor met his gaze, her smile polite, but unreadable. "Matters of justice concern us all, Lord Harrington. Some simply prefer to look the other way." A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, passed through his eyes before he continued, "And yet, despite having no official standing, you took it upon yourself to unearth information that has now resulted in," he gestured vaguely, "quite the scandal." Eleanor's grip on the oak surface did not tighten, but her voice carried an edge of steel. "Truth is only a scandal to those who fear it." Another murmur, sharper this time. Somewhere to her right, she caught the briefest movement. Lucian Fairfax, leaning forward, fingers steepled, eyes gleaming with the detached amusement of a predator watching its prey struggle. He had not intervened, not yet. Because that was the nature of power, it never rushed, never wasted energy when patience would suffice. Eleanor knew this game, had been walking its knife's edge since the moment she stepped into that infernal ballroom weeks ago, where the chandeliers had gleamed like the promise of salvation, and the laughter had been a carefully composed melody designed to lull the unsuspecting. She had been warned. She had been shunned. And now here she stood facing the final gauntlet. But the truth, once unearthed, had a way of refusing to be buried again, a shift in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible. A footman at the back of the room, exchanging glances with a man near the defense bench. A folded slip of paper passed unseen. Eleanor caught it all, but she did not react. Not yet. Tell me, Miss Graves, Harrington pressed. Do you truly believe you are capable of dismantling an empire built upon centuries of influence? Eleanor exhaled softly, almost amused. Empires do not fall in a single moment, my lord. They rot from within, long before the world realizes. This time the silence that followed was different, charged, expectant. Somewhere in the crowd, a glass was set down too hard, and then, as if the unseen forces holding the moment in balance had finally shifted, the heavy courtroom doors creaked open. A uniformed officer stepped in, bearing a sealed document, his face unreadable. Fairfax's fingers finally stilled. Lord Harrington turned, irritation flashing across his face for the briefest second. The presiding judge raised an eyebrow. Well? The officer cleared his throat. New evidence has been presented, Your Honor. It appears Miss Graves may not be as mistaken as some have presumed. The silence that followed was absolute, and in that silence Eleanor Graves allowed herself the smallest, most imperceptible of smiles. The game had not ended. It had only just begun. The heavy scent of candle wax and aged mahogany lingered in the dimly lit chamber as Eleanor Graves sat rigidly in the witness stand, her hands resting lightly against the polished wood, though every muscle in her body screamed to react. The air was thick, charged with the weight of unseen forces shifting against her, the tide of power moving as it always did, slowly, deliberately, and in favor of those who wielded it best. Across from her Lord Whittaker adjusted his spectacles with a calculated slowness, his expression carved from the same unyielding stone as the marble columns surrounding them. Miss Graves, he began, his voice like silk drawn over a blade, you have spent an inordinate amount of time investigating the unfortunate passing of Sir Hugo Blake, a tragedy, yes, but surely one long put to rest. Eleanor did not blink. A tragedy indeed, she agreed, her voice even, and yet, as I recall, a rather suspicious one. A shift in the jury, subtle but unmistakable. The judge, though outwardly impassive, flicked his gaze briefly toward the gallery, where men of significance sat in patient silence, watching, waiting. The prosecutor tapped his stack of documents, a quiet, deliberate gesture. You have cast doubt upon the integrity of respected figures, Miss Graves. You have suggested corruption at the highest levels of our institutions. He paused, letting the accusation settle. And yet, he continued, upon closer examination, your so-called evidence appears rather insubstantial. There it was. The knife, slipped cleanly between the ribs. Eleanor's lips did not so much as tighten, though in the quiet recesses of her mind, she traced the threads of the elaborate deception that had been woven around her. They had rewritten the narrative. Of course they had. She had expected resistance. What she had underestimated was the sheer force with which men like Lord Whittaker and his ilk could erase the truth, replacing it with something infinitely more palatable. The ledgers, the coded transactions, the hushed confessions whispered in the dim glow of candlelight, all of it had led her here. And yet, under the blinding scrutiny of this chamber, they had done more than discredit her. They had transformed her from a seeker of justice into a foolish woman who had dared to meddle in affairs far beyond her station. Perhaps, the prosecutor sighed, feigning sympathy, you were simply mistaken, Miss Graves. Perhaps, in your eagerness to uncover a grand conspiracy, you saw patterns where there were none. A well-placed chuckle echoed from the gallery, a scoff from an unseen voice, rehearsed reactions perfectly timed. Eleanor did not react. She could feel the scales tipping against her, could sense the whispers coiling like smoke around her name, the inevitable headlines already being written. Hysterical woman embarrasses herself in society scandal. The gavel struck. The room fell silent, but the damage had been done, not through logic, nor fact, but through the simple devastating force of perception. They had not disproven her. They had simply ensured that no one would believe her. Later, in the solitude of her rented chambers, Eleanor sat unmoving, staring at the cold, untouched cup of tea beside her. The city outside was alive with its usual indifference, and yet, within these walls, the weight of the night pressed down upon her. She had been outmaneuvered, not because she had been wrong. No, the truth was there, buried beneath layers of deceit, but because she had placed too much faith in its ability to stand alone. She had walked into a den of wolves, expecting that truth itself would be enough to unravel them. That was her mistake, not her deductions, not her evidence, but her belief that truth, by its nature, was invincible. A knock at the door. She did not move. A second knock, softer this time, insistent. Slowly she rose, crossing the room with measured steps, the steps of a woman who had been humbled but not broken. She opened the door. Standing in the dimly lit corridor was Inspector Harrow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a weary sigh, he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "Miss Graves," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. She studied his face, tired, frustrated, but not triumphant. She said nothing, waiting. After a pause, he ran a hand through his hair. "You were right." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" A wry, humorless smile, but knowing and proving, he exhaled. "Those are two very different things, aren't they?" Eleanor turned toward the window, staring out into the London streets that stretched beyond her reach. She should leave, return home, let the dust settle, and yet she was not done. Slowly she turned back to Harrow, her voice steady, her resolve unwavering. "They've won this round." He nodded, rubbing his jaw. "Yes, they have." A pause. Then, with the faintest ghost of a smile, she added, "But games like these don't end in a single round, do they?" The rain drummed softly against the city's tired streets, filling London with a quiet, lingering melancholy, as if the city itself carried a secret too heavy to share. Isabel Ashcroft pulled her damp shawl closer around her shoulders, sitting alone in a near-empty tea-room. The cup of tea before her had long gone cold, but her focus wasn't on it. It was on an old diary, its inked words written by Sir Hugo Blake, echoing in her mind like a ghostly whisper. The courtroom still haunted her, the skeptical glances, the thinly veiled smirks, the air of quiet finality, as her words were reduced to nothing more than a disregarded tale. "Miss Ashcroft, you've let your imagination get the best of you. What you saw was not what you think it was." They had won the case, but only in court. The truth still hung somewhere in the air, an image deliberately erased. But since when had she ever accepted defeat? "So what now?" Daniel Harrow's voice emerged from behind a newspaper. A journalist by trade, his smile always carried a hint of doubt, as if he never believed in anything until he had turned it over a dozen times in his mind. Isabel gave him a faint smile, but the depth in her eyes told another story. "They thought the game was over," she murmured, flipping through the brittle pages of the diary. "But this is just the beginning." Daniel ran a finger across a particular passage, scanning the words with practiced ease. "Sir Hugo Blake's death wasn't an accident." Isabel's voice was cold, not speculative, but certain. "In his final days he kept mentioning a name that doesn't exist in any official records. No bank transactions, no meetings, no history, and yet, it's everywhere." Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "And you're saying," Isabel placed her finger firmly against a single word in the diary, "Larkspur, just a word, yet it repeated itself throughout the pages, sometimes with an address, sometimes tied to a confidential document, and sometimes it would simply appear, then vanish without explanation. It wasn't just a name, it was a thread woven into every corner of the truth." Isabel glanced at Daniel, an almost amused glint in her eye. "I thought you were just a man who wrote about the truth, Daniel." Daniel let out a dry chuckle. Writers of truth tend to end up dead, Isabel. But those who hunt for it, sometimes, they win. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, as if the city itself was waiting, watching. This time, Isabel would play by their rules. She would move like them, hidden in the shadows. She would walk the same unseen paths. She would find the name that was everywhere, and yet, nowhere at all. The storm outside was relentless, its howling winds lashing against the rain-streaked windows of the dimly lit parlor, where Evelyn Harrow sat in still contemplation. A single candle flickered atop the heavy oak desk, its wax pooling in slow, deliberate surrender to time, much like the world Evelyn had once believed in. Before her, scattered in careful disorder, lay documents too damning to be ignored, confessions veiled in ambiguity, letters stained with desperation, and the final chilling note from Jonathan Alden, the man whose death had been ruled an accident. But Evelyn knew better. The ink on his last words trembled with urgency. They are watching, they are waiting. If I disappear, the answer lies in the hollow at Ravenswood. Do not trust the official story. Evelyn ran a finger along the parchment's frayed edges, her mind weaving through the pieces of a puzzle the world had chosen to discard. Alden had tried to warn them, but warnings were only useful to those willing to listen, and so he had been erased, not by the passing of time, but by careful, calculated hands. The inquiry had been swift, the conclusion inevitable. A man burdened by debts, by ghosts of his own making, a tragic but clear case of despair. That was the story they had sold to the public. That was the lie. A faint knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Daniel Ashford stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the dying embers in the fireplace. He closed the door behind him with quiet deliberation, his gaze finding hers in the candlelight. "You're still chasing ghosts, Evelyn." His voice was soft, edged with something between concern and intrigue. "You lost, remember? They made sure of it." Evelyn let out a slow breath, placing the letter atop the rest of her evidence. "They think they buried the truth," she said, her voice carrying none of the defeat they had expected from her. "But they only buried themselves in deeper lies." She reached for a folded newspaper on the desk, her fingers tapping against a single seemingly insignificant line buried within the financial section. "The Holloway Trust expands investments in Ravenswood Development Project." A name that had no business being there. A name she had seen before, hidden in the margins of Alden's final days. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Ravenswood," he muttered. "They're tying up loose ends." Evelyn's lips curled into something between a smile and a promise. Not all of them. The fire crackled, the storm outside raging on. Evelyn reached for a fresh sheet of paper, dipping her pen into the inkwell. Her handwriting remained as precise as ever, unshaken by the weight of what she was about to do. "My dear Inspector Graves," she began, pausing only for a moment before continuing with unwavering certainty. They had underestimated her once. It was a mistake they would not make again. A year had passed since Evelyn Harrow had been cast into disgrace, a year in which the world had carefully chosen to forget. The powerful had gone on with their affairs, their secrets buried beneath the weight of wealth and influence. In the grand halls of London, laughter still echoed over clinking crystal, and those who had orchestrated Jonathan Alden's fate had assumed their work was done. But Evelyn had not forgotten. She had spent those quiet months listening, watching, unraveling the careful web of lies thread by delicate thread. And now on a crisp morning, beneath the golden haze of a sun-drenched cafe in Covent Garden, she finally allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Across from her, Inspector Graves leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her with something between admiration and disbelief. "You always knew, didn't you?" His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind the words. Evelyn lifted her cup, the delicate porcelain warm against her fingertips, and took a measured sip before replying. "Not new, Inspector, suspected, and suspicion in the hands of the right person is a very dangerous thing." Graves exhaled, shaking his head. a rueful smile tugging at his lips. You waited them out, she had. It had taken time, patience and an unwavering commitment to silence. No grand accusations, no dramatic revelations, only whispers in the right places, small but strategic nudges that had unsettled the foundation beneath them. A dismissed clerk had come forward with discrepancies in financial records too damning to ignore. A foreign journalist had stumbled upon a buried transaction, printing a story that London's elite could not so easily suppress. And then the final misstep. Tobias Mercer, once untouchable, had attempted to eliminate a lingering threat only to be caught in the act. A bribe had been intercepted, a bank account traced, and in desperation, the guilty had turned on each other. The walls had closed in, one by one, they had fallen. Mercer arrested, Harrington fled to the Americas, his estate left in hurried disarray. Lord Redcliffe, stripped of his position, his name spoken in hushed tones over dinner tables, once eager for his company. And Evelyn, she had done what she always did. She had waited, she had watched, and she had won. Graves tapped a finger against the table, shaking his head. I suppose this is the part where you remind me you were right all along. Evelyn set her cup down, amusement flickering in her gaze. Oh, Inspector, that would be terribly unbecoming. He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. And no grand speeches about justice prevailing against corruption. She tilted her head slightly, the hint of a smile touching her lips. Justice, she murmured, is a quiet thing. It lingers even when men try very hard to bury it. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the small victory that had just unfolded within its walls. The powerful would find new ways to reclaim their positions, and the corrupt would weave new lies. But today the world was a little different than it had been before. And as Evelyn reached for her cup once more, setting it down with a quiet, deliberate click, she allowed herself a single, undeniable truth. This had never been about triumph. It had been about inevitability. And really, was there any better way to win?